On our wedding night, my wife plunged a kitchen knife straight into my heart and then burst into hysterical laughter. I couldn't understand why she would do this to me. With my last breath, I weakly asked her, "Wendy Roberts, why are you doing this?" She replied bitterly, "Simon Thomas, if it weren't for you, Frank and I wouldn't have been separated by our parents. He wouldn't have died tragically on the streets. All of this is your fault. You deserve to die." To my surprise, when I opened my eyes again, I had been reborn. This time, I decided to stay as far away from Wendy Roberts, that madwoman, as possible. Ding! Story Shots reminds you to click the subscribe button at the bottom right corner to read the full novel. Simon, have you seen the new transfer student? Doesn't he look a bit like a celebrity? Someone whispered, nudging my arm. I snapped back to reality and turned my head. It was Wendy Roberts, the very person who had stabbed me to death in my previous life. In the next second, I pinched my thigh hard, wanting to make sure this wasn't a dream. When I felt the sharp pain, my eyes welled up with tears of excitement. I had really been reborn. Reborn to this day in year 13 when Frank Johnson transferred to our class. In my previous life, Wendy had also been sitting there, chin in hand, looking at the newly transferred Frank with admiration. At the time, I thought she was just joking around. But not long after, I saw her sitting on the back of Frank's motorcycle, arms wrapped tightly around his waist. This time, instead of saying, "He doesn't look like anyone," as I had in my previous life, I agreed with her. "He does indeed." Wendy heard this and pouted, dissatisfied with my response. "You're so half-hearted." I didn't want to say anything more to her, so I lowered my head, pretending to read my book. But in my mind, I was thinking that in this life, I must stay far, far away from her. In her previous life, Frank Johnson, the man Wendy Roberts loved with all her heart, had always been a womanizer and a playboy. It was said that in his former school, he had pursued almost every attractive girl there. He was used to living a carefree life. While others were anxiously preparing for their exams, he was out drinking and partying every night. Whenever teachers tried to counsel him, he would always retort, "Who says youth should only look one way?" Ironically, it was this bad boy image that held a fatal attraction for many well-behaved girls. Wendy Roberts was one of them. In her previous life, when Wendy plunged a knife into my heart, I was utterly bewildered. On the brink of death, I mustered my last breath to weakly ask her, "Wendy, why did you do this?" She replied with bitter resentment, "Simon, if it weren't for you, Frank and I wouldn't have been separated by our parents. He wouldn't have died on the streets. All of this is your fault. You deserve to die." At that moment, I finally realized she had harbored such deep hatred towards me for so many years. Even if I was wrong to tell her parents about her teenage romance, how was Frank's death my fault? I didn't make him join a gang. I didn't make him get into armed conflicts. I wasn't the one who stabbed him to death. If Wendy wanted revenge, shouldn't she go after the thug who killed Frank? Why did she have to blame everything on me? But by then, I was no longer able to argue with her. My vision went dark, and I lost consciousness completely. So in this new life, I'm determined not to interfere with the fate of Wendy, that deranged woman, lest I become the target of her hatred again. Sure enough, in this life, as Frank Johnson was assigned by the teacher to sit behind Wendy Roberts, their relationship progressed rapidly just like in the previous life. Within a month, they were secretly dating. Like rebellious teenagers in TV dramas, they skipped classes to play games at the internet cafe. They held hands in the pouring rain and kissed under romantic plane trees. They rode motorcycles at midnight, racing through the streets. While they were in the throes of their romance, I was nervously preparing for my A-levels. In my previous life, it was because of Wendy Roberts that I chose the art stream. Now, I plan to switch to the science stream and start my own life path. Suddenly changing streams would undoubtedly be difficult to keep up with, but no matter how challenging, I wanted to try. On the day I officially transferred, Wendy Roberts angrily confronted me. "Why didn't you tell me in advance about such a big decision to change streams?" I found it amusing internally. Who did she think she was to me? Did I need to report everything I did to her in advance? Seeing that I remained silent, she loudly questioned me again. Why aren't you saying anything? I replied to her in a calm tone. Changing streams is my own business. I don't see any reason why I should have to tell you about it. Hearing me say this, she was stunned for a moment, then said irritably, Simon Thomas, how could you? But before she could finish, I walked away without looking back. A few days later, I overheard Frank Johnson bragging to some boys from his class in the men's toilet. That Wendy Roberts is like a leech, so clingy. If it weren't for her participating in so many competitions and having some fame, making me look good when I take her out, I wouldn't want to be with her at all. One classmate teased, Stop boasting. Even Simon Thomas, with his good grades and good looks, couldn't win Wendy Roberts over. How could you possibly have a chance? Frank confidently said, Don't you believe me? I even kissed her last night. Girls just love my dominant style. She's completely devoted to me now. Another classmate said, I heard she's about to participate in a dance competition. If you're so capable, why don't you make her skip it? Frank replied, That's easy. Just wait and see. I waited in the toilet cubicle until I heard their footsteps fade away before coming out. In my previous life, I knew Frank Johnson had ill intentions. I had tried to hint at this to Wendy Roberts several times, but she thought I was just trying to cause trouble and ruin their relationship. Seeing her falling deeper, I hesitated but still told her parents. This time, I decided to learn from my mistakes and absolutely not get involved in her affairs. But ironically, she came to me on her own initiative. One evening, as I was returning home from school, I saw Wendy Roberts sitting outside my front door. Looking at the scattered beer bottles on the ground, I wondered how much she had drunk. Would she throw a drunken fit at me? When she saw me, she immediately scrambled to her feet and grabbed my arm, saying, Simon, Frank's ignoring me. Can you help me get in touch with him? He suddenly said he wanted to break up with me today. I don't even know what I did wrong. I really don't know what to do anymore. I love him. I'd do anything for him. I frowned as I looked at her haggard appearance. She used to be so careful about her diet to maintain her figure, and she never drank alcohol, afraid it would affect her physical condition. But now, she didn't care about anything for the sake of Frank Johnson. She no longer resembled the girl I once fancied. After a moment's thought, I took out my phone and called Frank Johnson. Frank, Wendy's drunk outside my house. She says she wants to see you. She stood nervously beside me, looking at the phone with hopeful eyes. Frank seemed to sneer on the other end of the line and said, Ask her if she really loves me enough to do anything for me? I had the speakerphone on, so Wendy naturally heard it too. She immediately shouted, Of course, I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't ignore me. Then don't go to the dance competition, Frank said, and hung up the phone. Wendy was left standing there, stunned. I actually wanted to see how she would choose this time without my intervention. Career or love, which would she choose? After a moment of shock, Wendy mumbled, Is this really the only way to prove I love him? I didn't respond to her words, just watched as she dejectedly walked away. Later, Wendy indeed didn't go to the dance competition, because her leg was injured. I didn't know if it was truly a coincidence or if she had deliberately hurt herself. Anyway, one day I overheard my mum saying that Wendy's mum had told her Wendy had been having such bad luck lately. She could have won an award at the dance competition and secured a place at university. But just before the competition, she accidentally sprained her ankle. Because of this, Wendy's mum wanted to invite my mum to go to church together to pray for some peace of mind. After hearing this, I sneered. I thought to myself that no amount of praying could save someone as lovesick as Wendy. A few days later, I indeed saw Wendy and Frank walking hand in hand, sweetly making their way home. Frank held a cigarette in his left hand, blowing smoke into Wendy's face. Wendy seemed to enjoy it, even standing on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. Frank then pulled her into a small alley, took a drag of his cigarette, and slowly blew the smoke into her mouth. The next second, Wendy actively wrapped her arms around Frank's neck and kissed him. In an instant, they were like fire and gasoline, kissing so intensely that their saliva formed strings between their mouths. Before long, Frank actually picked Wendy up in his arms in broad daylight and carried her into a nearby motel. In my previous life, when I saw them going to get a room, I rushed over like a madman to stop them, only to be pushed away by Wendy. She had even impatiently said to me, "Simon, who are you to me? What right do you have to always interfere?" But in this life, not only would I not interfere, I actually hoped she would sink deeper into the mire. Soon, we faced our exams. As expected, Wendy Roberts' grades plummeted, landing her in the bottom 10 of our year. I, on the other hand, shot straight into the top 10. This sudden change made both teachers and classmates look at me with newfound respect. I realized that since I'd stopped meddling in Wendy's affairs, everything I did became twice as effective. One day during break, I went to the staff room to ask a maths question. To my surprise, I saw Wendy's mom talking to her head teacher. Mrs. Roberts, with a pleading tone, asked the head teacher, "Is there any way to quickly improve Wendy's grades? Her recent test results have been absolutely dreadful." It was then that the head teacher informed her about Wendy and Frank Johnson's early romance. Mrs. Roberts finally understood the reason behind Wendy's recent unusual behavior. As she left the staff room, she frantically grabbed passing students, asking where Frank was. When she finally found him, she delivered a resounding slap across his face. The usually noisy corridor fell silent in an instant. Frank, holding his cheek, stared at her in disbelief and shouted, "Who do you think you are, you mad woman? What right do you have to hit me?" Mrs. Roberts glared at him coldly. "What right? The right of a mother whose daughter's future you've ruined. Do you have any idea how much effort I've put into raising her to where she is now?" Hearing this, Frank rolled his eyes and said, "Please get your facts straight. It was your precious daughter who begged me to be with her. I didn't hold a knife to her throat and force her into a relationship." Upon hearing this, Mrs. Roberts turned pale with anger and started to pull at Frank's hair. Just then, Wendy, having somehow heard the news, rushed over. She shielded Frank behind her and shouted at her mother, "Mom, if you want to hit someone, hit me. I'm the one who insisted on being with him." Mrs. Roberts, clearly shocked that her usually obedient daughter would defy her for a boy, trembled with rage, nearly losing her balance. She slapped Wendy as well, then said with bitter disappointment, "If you were with a good lad like Simon, I might have accepted it. But why on earth would you choose this good-for-nothing? Are you trying to send me to an early grave?" Having been suddenly mentioned, I desperately wanted to leave this messy situation. But at that moment, everyone turned to look at me. Frank angrily pointed at me and said, "Simon Thomas, so you're the one who snitched." Wendy looked at me, lips pursed, saying nothing, but her gaze was terrifyingly intense. I felt utterly helpless. In this life, I hadn't meddled in their affairs at all. How on earth did I end up involved again? I threw up my hands and shouted at them, "Your business has absolutely nothing to do with me. I didn't say anything, so don't drag me into your problems. And Mrs. Roberts, please clarify to both of them whether I actually told you about this or not." Frank Johnson, however, was convinced that I had been the one to snitch. At that moment, Wendy's head teacher arrived and grabbed Mrs. Roberts, urging her to calm down. Mrs. Roberts finally managed to contain her temper. "If your head teacher hadn't told me, I wouldn't have known what you've been up to behind my back." I guessed that Wendy and Frank had been caught canoodling at school by a classmate, who then reported it to the head teacher. That's why the head teacher had no choice but to call Mrs. Roberts, hoping that, as a parent, she could properly manage Wendy's behavior. Regardless of how it happened, I was now cleared of any suspicion of tattling. After that day, their affair became known throughout the entire school. Teenage relationships were common at school, and sometimes parents would even come to complain, usually ending with the young couple breaking up. In more serious cases, one of them might transfer to another school. Their situation, causing such a commotion, was considered particularly serious. Frank Johnson was a sports student, already struggling academically. He believed that with his athletic talents, he could easily get into any university. Naturally, he refused to transfer schools for Wendy Roberts. He even felt frustrated, often complaining to his classmates. I've dated so many times before without any issues. But since I started dating Wendy, I've got nothing but trouble. If she weren't so obedient to me, I'd dump her right now. One night, as I was revising late at home, I suddenly heard the sound of an ambulance from downstairs. I saw my parents hurriedly putting on their coats and rushing out, so I followed behind them. We saw Mr. and Mrs. Roberts carrying Wendy out. Blood was continuously flowing from Wendy's left wrist. Looking at her face, I saw it had lost all color. As she passed by me, she was still muttering, "Simon, please tell Frank that I'd do anything for him. Even die. Just ask him not to leave me." I stood there frozen, as if paralyzed, thinking this poor girl was nearly bleeding to death, yet still thinking about that boy. The tendons in Wendy's left hand were severed. Even though they were reattached in time, her hand would never be the same. She didn't seem to care, saying it was proof of her love for Frank, a testament to her passionate youth. But only I knew that she could have been on stage now, becoming the most famous ballerina, enjoying everyone's admiring gaze. But in this life, she chose a completely different path for herself. Classmates looked at the obvious scars on her wrist from self-harm, their eyes filled with shock and incomprehension. Wendy, however, proudly told her classmates, "The scars on my hand are the medals of Frank's and my love." Hearing this, the classmates couldn't help but frown, looking at her as if she were mad. In the final term of sixth form, I immersed myself in more intense revision for the upcoming A-levels. Only occasionally, during dinner, would I hear my mum mention Wendy Roberts. She said that next door, Mrs. Roberts had been complaining to her about Frank Johnson's outrageous demands for expensive gifts from Wendy. Things like basketball shoes costing hundreds of pounds, leather jackets worth thousands, and motorbikes priced at tens of thousands. Whatever Frank asked for, Wendy would buy it for him. But where would she get that kind of money? Of course, she'd come back and ask her parents. Mrs. Roberts cried and complained endlessly to my mum, finally saying she hoped my mum would also try to talk some sense into Wendy, hoping she could find her way back. When I heard this, alarm bells rang in my head. I quickly said to my mum, "Mum, don't meddle in other people's affairs. It's not worth the effort and might backfire on you." My mum thought I had a point. She finally sighed helplessly and said, "Wendy was such a good girl. It's a shame she's ruining herself like this." I remembered in my previous life, I couldn't bear to see Wendy destroy her future, so I tried to pull her out of the mess Frank had dragged her into. But in the end, not only was she ungrateful, she even hated me to the core. This time around, I'll let her live the life she wants. Even if she ends up rotten and stinking, it's her own choice. After dinner, I buried myself in past papers again. After months of relentless effort, I finally managed to submit a satisfactory set of A-level exams. Wendy, on the other hand, failed her art school auditions due to a hand injury. She had no choice but to take the regular A-level route like the rest of us. After the exams, our class representative organized a graduation dinner and invited me, their former classmate, to attend. I thought Wendy and Frank wouldn't have the nerve to show up, so I agreed to go. To my surprise, they both came on the day. Wendy wore a tight-fitting black dress with large, wavy blonde curls, looking far more mature than girls our age. Frank wore a black leather biker jacket and ripped jeans, his hair dyed bright yellow, looking every bit the troublemaker. After the meal, the teachers left first, leaving the students to let loose and speak freely. Suddenly, Jessie Watson, our class's academic representative, spoke in a voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know what Wendy's so proud of, dressing like a streetwalker." Wendy and Frank had always been flamboyant in class. They used to whisper during evening study sessions, and occasionally Frank would even get handsy with Wendy. And Wendy, far from rejecting his advances, would respond with suggestive whimpers. Their behavior was particularly annoying and troublesome for the classmates sitting around them. Jessie had been sitting right behind Frank before I changed classes, so she must have been thoroughly disgusted by the two of them. I heard her exam results weren't great this time, so she must have been harboring quite a grudge against Wendy and Frank for constantly disrupting her studies. But unexpectedly, when Wendy heard this, she didn't get angry. Instead, she smiled mockingly at Jessie and said, "What's the matter? Are you jealous that I have a boyfriend and you don't? Or do you fancy my boyfriend?" She then turned back to Frank with a coquettish smile. Jessie snorted coldly, "Wendy, only you would think Frank is such a prize." Frank, who overheard this, suddenly looked displeased. He stood up and said, "You're so ugly. No wonder no bloke wants you." After saying this, Frank turned and kissed Wendy beside him, kissing her so intensely that their saliva formed strings between their mouths. It seems he really thought Jessie fancied him and was deliberately kissing Wendy to upset her. Good Lord, where does this man get his confidence from? "Frank, Wendy, if you want a canoodle, there's a small hotel next door. You can go there to release your passion." Our class representative scolded them sternly, but they seemed unwilling to give up this opportunity to perform in front of everyone and continued to kiss passionately. Many classmates cried out that it was burning their eyes and started to leave. Just as I was about to stand up and leave, Frank let go of Wendy and came over to block my way. He stared at me smugly and said, "Don't think I don't know you've always fancied Wendy. But let me tell you, don't be a frog lusting after swan's flesh. She's been my woman for a long time." I sneered, "Frank, not everyone thinks Wendy is such a prize." With that, I didn't want to tangle with the two of them anymore and left the restaurant directly. While waiting for the bus, I couldn't help but think that these two were truly a match made in heaven. Both think they're God's gift to the world, but they don't realize that in others' eyes, they're just a pair of nutters. "Simon!" I heard someone calling my name from behind. I turned around and saw it was Wendy Roberts. She walked up to me, hesitated for a moment, and then said, "Don't mind what Frank said. He's just overly protective of me." I looked at her face and suddenly asked a question that had been weighing on my mind for a long time. "Do you really think it's worth it?" She stared at me, confused, seemingly not understanding why I asked this. I asked again, "Giving up ballet? Giving up your studies? Do you really think it's worth it?" She was taken aback for a moment, then smiled and said, "Of course it's worth it. Every day I've been with Frank, I felt so relaxed and free." I was stunned, thinking that this downward freedom wasn't real freedom at all. But on the surface, I smiled faintly and said, "Well, I hope you'll keep feeling that way in the future." At that moment, Frank Johnson came running out of the restaurant. He saw us talking by the roadside. Without asking a single question, he rushed over and slapped Wendy across the face. "You sneaky little minx, Wendy. You said you were going to the loo, but you were actually sneaking out here to flirt with other men." Wendy held her cheek, but instead of getting angry about being hit, she coyly said to Frank, "Frank, I'm carrying your child now. Why are you still so distrustful of me? From the beginning, you've been the only one in my heart." I was so shocked my jaw nearly hit the floor. They were only 18 and about to become parents? And what Wendy just said, which soap opera did that line come from? It sounded so familiar. Just then, a taxi passed by, and I immediately hailed it. As soon as it stopped, I quickly opened the door and jumped in, afraid that if I waited a second longer, I'd be dragged back into their drama. Once inside, I glanced at them through the rearview mirror. To my surprise, in that short moment, they were somehow embracing again, kissing passionately. Apparently, Frank's slap earlier was just foreplay, and perhaps I was just a prop in their twisted little play. Soon after, the A-level results came out. Neither Wendy nor Frank got into university, but after months of tireless effort, I was accepted into the University of Cambridge. I was overjoyed, not only because I got into a good university, but also because I could finally get away from that crazy couple. To celebrate my university acceptance, my parents booked a restaurant and invited friends and family. As our next-door neighbors, Wendy's parents were naturally invited too. Of course, Wendy didn't come. My usually reserved father, his face flushed from drinking, raised his glass to toast everyone. When it came to Wendy's parents' turn, my dad couldn't help but say, "Ah, what a shame about Wendy." Wendy's mom, hearing this, her eyes welled up, and her face turned extremely uncomfortable. She forced out a smile. Fortunately, my mom quickly smoothed things over, saying, "University isn't the only path. True talent will always shine through." My dad immediately caught on and laughed awkwardly. Yes, yes, of course. The holidays flew by, and my high school classmates went their separate ways. During my first semester at university, I occasionally heard updates about the couple through our class group chat. Apparently, they had a wedding ceremony, but couldn't legally marry due to their age. Frank Johnson started delivering takeaways, a far cry from his former ambitious self. Wendy Roberts stayed at home to care for their baby after giving birth, never venturing out to work. As time passed, I became engrossed in my studies and stopped checking the high school group chat. After graduation, armed with knowledge of future developments from my previous life, I secured a position at a reputable company. Within 5 years, I received several promotions. I became the envy of my peers, a successful young professional. There were quite a few girls interested in me, but I hadn't met anyone who truly captured my heart. My parents repeatedly suggested I try blind dating, but each time I would change the subject. Finally, one day, my dad asked me over the phone, "Simon, you're not still hung up on that girl next door, are you?" I was taken aback. It had been ages since I'd heard Wendy Roberts' name. I chuckled lightly. "Dad, how could that be possible?" "Good, that's good," he said, sounding relieved. I found his words utterly ridiculous. In this life, not only was I not pining for Wendy Roberts, but even hearing her name made me feel sick. However, I never expected that during a holiday visit home, I would run into a heavily pregnant Wendy Roberts in the lift. After so many years, I almost didn't recognize her. The woman before me bore no resemblance to the graceful ballerina she once was. Her once lustrous black hair had thinned considerably, with visible patches of scalp showing through. Her skin was sallow and rough, lined with wrinkles, and she looked utterly worn out. But the most significant change wasn't her appearance. It was her eyes. They once held a spark, but now they were dull and lifeless, like those of a fish. I thought perhaps the recent car accident that claimed both her parents had taken a heavy toll on her, leaving her in this dispirited state. "Simon Thomas?" she called out, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Perhaps she hadn't expected to bump into me in the lift. I nodded in acknowledgement, then lowered my head to reply to some messages from friends. Wendy, however, initiated a conversation. "Simon, how have you been all these years?" I responded nonchalantly, "All right, and you?" She gave a bitter smile and said, "Just okay, I suppose. I've been stuck at home as a full-time housewife all these years. I thought I might be able to find a job once our eldest started nursery, but then I unexpectedly got pregnant again." As she spoke, the disappointment and regret in her eyes were impossible to hide. I thought to myself, "Serves you right." Soon enough, we reached the 3rd floor. As the lift doors opened, I felt an immediate sense of relief. Even after so many years, I still occasionally dreamt of the scene from my previous life when she tried to kill me. Being alone with her made my palms sweat. After all, when she lost control, she was truly capable of taking a life. Just as I was about to enter my flat, I heard Frank Johnson's angry shout from next door as Wendy opened their door. "Wendy Roberts, I just sent you out for a few bottles of beer. Why did it take so long? Where's the beer? Why didn't you buy it?" I was shocked by Frank's harsh attitude towards the pregnant Wendy. It seemed their once passionate love had faded over the years of marriage. That evening, after dinner with my parents, we were sitting on the sofa preparing to watch TV. Suddenly, we heard a commotion from next door, followed by a child's heart-wrenching cries. "Wah! Daddy! Don't! Mummy!" Hearing this, my mum sighed deeply and said, "Poor Wendy. Her husband always throws tantrums when he's drunk. He even hits her and little Ben sometimes." I asked, "Who's Ben?" My dad answered for Mum. "Ben is Wendy's eldest son. He's only about 4 years old, very well behaved and obedient, but for some reason, his dad often beats him at home." Just as my dad finished speaking, we heard a woman's agonized screams from next door. My mum turned to my dad with concern and said, "Dear, we should go over and try to stop this." My dad nodded and was about to get up when I quickly intervened. It's best not to interfere in other people's family matters. But my mum wouldn't listen, saying she had watched Wendy grow up and couldn't stand by and do nothing. Worried about my parents' safety, I reluctantly followed behind them. Just as we were about to knock, Wendy came out carrying Ben. Her face was covered in bruises, and blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. Little Ben in her arms was sobbing, looking utterly pitiful. "Where do you think you're going?" Frank rushed out, grabbing Wendy by the hair and yanking her back inside, completely disregarding the onlookers at the door. "Stop it! What kind of man hits a woman?" my dad shouted angrily as he stepped inside. Frank looked at my parents, then at me and sneered, "Wendy Roberts is my wife. I'll hit her if I want to, and it's none of your business." "Frank, dear, it doesn't matter if Wendy is your wife or not. Hitting someone is against the law," my mum said, trying to pry his hand from Wendy's hair, but he shoved her away. "Mom, darling," my dad and I cried out simultaneously, rushing to catch her. "Dad, take Mum home first," I urged. "But what about Wendy?" My mum was still worried about Wendy's safety. "I'll handle this," I shouted impatiently, hoping they would leave quickly. Only then did my mum reluctantly return home with my dad. After they left, I said to Frank, "It's been years since we last met. How have you become someone who hits women?" He scoffed. "It's all because of this damn woman. She deserves it." Seeing his flushed face and unfocused eyes, it was clear he was drunk and not in his right mind. I didn't bother arguing further and was about to call the police. "No, Simon, please don't call the police," Wendy pleaded, realizing my intention. I gave her a puzzled look. Meeting my gaze, she explained, "He doesn't mean it. He just can't control himself when he's drunk. He'll be fine once he sobers up." Hearing her say this, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "If it weren't for my parents, I wouldn't even bother with you," I snapped before leaving their flat. Back home, my mum pulled me aside to ask how they were doing. I replied flatly, "They're a match made in heaven. One likes to hit, the other likes to be hit. Don't worry about it. Look at the time, you should get some rest." Hearing this, my mum had no choice but to go to bed. But in the middle of the night, Wendy knocked on our door. After my mum let her in with Ben in her arms, she just silently wept, saying nothing. It was little Ben who choked out, "Dad drank again tonight, and he started hitting me and Mum." Hearing the child say this, I was stunned. It seemed that Frank frequently got drunk and violent at home. No wonder Wendy looked so different when I saw her this time. She had completely lost her former vibrant and outgoing demeanor. Though not even 30, she now exuded an aura of someone at death's door. I had thought it was the shock of losing her parents, but it turned out she was living under Frank's constant abuse. Bang! 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 Someone was kicking our door violently. There was no need to guess, it had to be Frank. "Come out, Wendy Roberts. Don't think I don't know you're in there," he shouted while pounding on the door. By now, Wendy was trembling uncontrollably with fear. Crying, she clutched my mum's arm and said, "Mrs. Thomas, please don't open the door. He drank a lot more after you left earlier, and now he's in a drunken rage." My mum, seeing her shaking uncontrollably, quickly reassured her. "It's all right, we won't open it. Don't be afraid." Couldn't help but frown. Why did Wendy Roberts always have to haunt us like this? Earlier, when I wanted to call the police to help her seek protection, she refused. Now that Frank had beaten her badly, she came running to our house for help. Humph, was our family destined to be a part of their ridiculous love story in both my past and present lives? I quietly returned to my room, closed the door, and immediately called the police on my mobile. This sort of thing is best left to the authorities. My family and I can't be her shield forever. If she's not willing to see sense, then she deserves what she gets. 5 years have passed, and I don't believe this is the first time Frank has hit her. Yet she still chooses to stay. Not only has she not filed for divorce, but she's pregnant with their second child. Doesn't she realize how miserable it is for children to live in constant fear in such a household? Wendy Roberts, get out here now. Don't tell me you've seen Simon Thomas doing well and want to go back to him. Ha! You're about to be a mother of two. Do you really think he'd still want you? Frank Johnson continued to shout from outside. Wendy's face turned crimson upon hearing this. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. Seeing my angry expression, she timidly lowered her head and began to cry even harder. At that moment, Frank suddenly shouted from outside, "I'm a good person, officers. I'm a good man, I swear." I went to the peephole and looked out. Sure enough, the police had arrived. When Wendy saw the police, she pointed her finger at me accusingly and demanded, "Simon, who told you to call the police? Frank only acts like this when he's had too much to drink." I cut her off sharply, saying, "Tell that to the police, not me. This is between you two. Don't drag me or my family into it." She was immediately at a loss for words. By this time, neighbors from upstairs and downstairs had come to see what the commotion was about. They began voicing their complaints one after another. Mr. Lambert from the second floor said, "Officers, you don't know the half of it. This couple is always smashing things at home, making such a racket that my son can't even study properly." Mrs. Wright from the fourth floor, still in her nightgown, huffed angrily, "That's right, officers. He's always beating his wife, and she screams like a banshee. One night I woke up hearing it and thought the place was haunted. I was so frightened I had to take heart medication." Seeing the situation, the police decided to take the inebriated Frank Johnson to the station for questioning. This finally sobered him up. He began bowing and scraping to the two officers, trying to explain. "Officers, this is all a misunderstanding. I've had a bit too much to drink tonight, so I might have spoken a bit loudly, but I've always been a law-abiding citizen." Wendy rushed over, hurriedly trying to explain as well. "Yes, officers, he just had too much to drink. He was only playing around with me and our son." The police took one look at the bruises on Wendy's face and wordlessly led Frank away. Wendy picked up her son and followed them. In an instant, the world finally fell silent. The next morning, I told my parents early that I planned to take them on a road trip during the holiday. My parents were delighted when they heard this. The two of them had worked hard all their lives and had never even been out of the county. We quickly packed our bags, got in the car, and headed for the seaside. The place had blue skies and clear waters, with a warm climate perfect for elderly people to visit in winter. Actually, I had originally planned to take time off work next month to take them. But now I had to bring this trip forward. I didn't want my parents to stay at home and be bothered by Wendy Roberts. However, on the third day after we arrived, my mom saw some shocking news in the residents' group that left her stunned. The subject of the news was Wendy Roberts. She had been killed in her home by Frank Johnson. My mom could hardly believe it when she saw it. She immediately called our upstairs neighbor, Allison Wright, to ask what had happened. Allison's second daughter works as a clerk at the police station, so she naturally had first-hand information. It turned out that after Frank was taken away by the police that day, Wendy had gone to plead for him, saying that her injuries were self-inflicted and had nothing to do with Frank. She even claimed she had a tendency for self-harm, that she liked to hit herself for no reason, and the harder she hit herself, the more satisfied she felt, which was why she always had bruises on her face. The police knew she was lying, but without evidence, there was nothing they could do to help her even if they wanted to. So they only gave Frank a warning for disturbing the peace at night and then let him go. But that same evening, the neighbors heard Wendy screaming and crying again. This time, however, no one called the police for her. Another day passed. When Allison returned from visiting relatives, she saw little Ben covered in blood in the lift. She thought the child had been beaten by Frank and quickly called the police. But when the police tried to contact his parents, They found that both Wendy and Frank's phones were switched off. So they took Ben to the house, but after knocking for half an hour, no one answered. It wasn't until Ben suddenly said, "Mummy? Blood? Knife? Baby hungry." Only then did the police realize something was seriously wrong. When they finally broke down the door, they found Wendy lying in a pool of blood with a kitchen knife sticking straight out of her chest, her eyes still open in death. Frank had already disappeared without a trace. When my mum learned all this, she couldn't stop crying. As for me, I felt a chill run down my spine. It turned out that after I stopped interfering with her fate, this was her ending. In my previous life, it was my kindness that made me take her place and get stabbed to death. Thinking of this, I couldn't help but clench my fists, cold sweat dripping down my back. A month later, I bought my parents a luxurious detached house in their hometown. It had small gardens in both the front and back, which the elderly couple adored. In this life, I was determined to live well and ensure my parents could enjoy their golden years comfortably. During the holiday break at home, as our family gathered around the television, Allison Wright called. My mum put the call on speakerphone, chatting with her while we continued watching TV. Suddenly, she mentioned Frank Johnson. "Oh, by the way, I heard from my daughter today that Frank Johnson has been found by the police." My mum quickly asked, "Where did they find him?" Allison replied, "In that small alley next to the market." "Oh my, you wouldn't believe it. When they found him, he'd been horribly beaten up." Upon hearing this, my mind went blank, and I dropped my Coke on the floor. Frank Johnson had been beaten to death. In this life, he had met the same fate as in my previous one. Only this time, there was no Wendy Roberts to try and pin his death on me. "Simon, what are you daydreaming about?" My dad nudged me with his elbow. I snapped back to reality and smiled, saying, "It's nothing. I was just thinking about where to take you and Mum on holiday." Hearing this, my parents smiled contentedly. In this life, I could finally live well, unburdened by that madwoman Wendy Roberts.